Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Prophet Nuh alayhi salam to earth 1,000 years after sending Prophet Adam alayhi salam. The population on earth had increased many folds by now. And by this time, the evil shaitan had played his dirty tricks with mankind, and people had started worshipping idols. It was during this time that Allah sent another prophet to earth, Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, to guide the people back. But it wasn't going to be an easy job for the prophet. "Fear Allah and do what Allah says," shouted the prophet to everyone. But the people didn't want to listen. They shook their heads and continued worshipping the idols. The prophet was an excellent speaker, and he was very patient too. "Don't you understand that it was Allah who created this whole world?" shouted the prophet. "It was Allah who created the sun, the moon, and the stars you see in the sky. He created the rivers, the mountains, the trees, and everything you see around. He did all this for you, and you alone. Then why are you not showing him any respect? Why are you worshipping these idols?" But the people turned their backs on him, saying, "Who are you to advise us? You're just another man, and we think that you're lying. Go away and leave us alone." But there were good Muslims on earth too. Most of them were weak and poor. They listened to the words of the Prophet and realized that they were committing a sin by worshipping the idols. Now, there were two different groups of people on earth. One who worshipped Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the others who continued idol worship. Nuh alayhi salam continued preaching to the people for many years. The idol worshippers soon became tired of the Prophet. "You've been preaching lies for long enough," they said. "We are going to stone you if you do not stop." But the Prophet ignored them and continued calling the people tirelessly. He preached to them during the day and the night. On many occasions, he was stoned by the idol worshippers while preaching to the crowd. He was even beaten with the sticks. "You are no different from us," shouted the idol worshippers. "You are no prophet. You are just another man. And why should we listen to you? I am telling you the truth," the Prophet pleaded to them. "You are committing a sin by worshipping the idols." But the people didn't listen and they beat him again. "I fear for you. Allah is going to punish you one day," the Prophet shouted to them. All this pain did not let the Prophet to stop calling out to the people. He continued preaching to them for 950 years. The disbelievers kept making fun of the Prophet, and by now, they had taken things too far. Nuh alayhi salam was disappointed by now, whereas the number of disbelievers kept growing and growing. One night, when the Prophet was offering his prayers, Allah spoke to him. "Don't be sad, Nuh," God said to the Prophet. "You have done what you were asked to. I am going to punish all the people on earth for their wrongdoings. Everyone on earth is going to die, except the Muslims and the animals," said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As the first step, God then asked the Prophet to plant many trees. Nuh alayhi salam didn't understand the reason behind this, but he listened to Allah and started planting trees as he was told. He also asked the good Muslims who listened to him to do the same. They did this for more than 100 years. After many years, Allah spoke to the Prophet again. This time, he asked the Prophet to start building a ship. "It has to be a huge ship that can accommodate a pair of every animal on this earth," said Allah. The Prophet was confused. He didn't know how to build a ship, and no one had ever made a ship before. In spite of this, the Prophet started making the ship with the help of the Malaks. First, they made plans for building the ship. No one knows the exact size of the ship. Some say it had a length of 600 feet, and others say it had a length of 2,400 feet. Whatever it was, the ship was sure going to be a gigantic one. "We will help you to build the ship," said his children and the Muslims, and they joined the Prophet. First, the Prophet had to choose a place for building the ship. He chose the mountains far, far away from the city. The Prophet collected the tools and set out to build the ship. They started cutting down the trees for wood. Yes, it was the same trees he had planted more than 100 years back. Then they started building the ship as per the plan. The men worked very hard, day and night, to build the ship. When the disbelievers saw the Prophet building a ship on the top of a mountain, they started making fun of him. "Ha! You are such an old fool," they said. "Why would you possibly need a ship so huge?" The others said, "And how are you going to take it to the sea?" "You would come to know very soon," replied the Prophet. The people didn't know why the Prophet was building the ship, and they thought the Prophet had lost his mind. The Prophet and his men kept working hard. After many months, the ship was finally ready. They then thanked Allah for helping them to finish the ship. The time for the flood was nearing day by day. One night, Allah told the Prophet that he will start flooding the earth the day when the Prophet sees water coming out of the stove in his house. You see, this huge ship built by the Prophet had 3 different sections. For 3 different types of animals, Amir. The first one was for birds. The second part of the structure was for humans. And the third part was for the animals.
MashaAllah.
While the day of the flood got nearer, animals and the birds started arriving one by one. They were arriving in pairs, one male and a female. There were elephants, giraffes, lions, rabbits, parrots, and soon the ship was filled with all the variety of animals and birds from the earth. And one day, like God had told the Prophet, water suddenly started coming out of his stove in his kitchen. This was the sign Nuh alayhi salam was waiting for. He knew that the time of the flood had arrived. When he went out, he saw that it had started raining too. Without wasting any time, he ran out and called all the good Muslims who had helped him to build the ship. He asked all of them to board the ship immediately. The disbelievers didn't understand what was going on, so they kept laughing at the Prophet. "Look at the old fool," they said. "What is he going to do with all those animals and men?" The Prophet ignored them and asked his wives and sons to board the ship quickly. Everyone obeyed him, except for one of his wife and her son, who were not his followers. "I will save myself from the water," his son said. "Don't worry about me." The water levels had gone up by now, so the Prophet ran to board the ship. A terrible flood broke out, and the water levels began to rise rapidly. The earth's crust moved, and ocean floors started rising, which caused it to flood the dry lands. The rains didn't stop for hours either. By now, people realized that what the Prophet told them was true, and they ran towards the mountains to save themselves. The Prophet saw that his wife and son were climbing a mountain to escape from the water. So he shouted to them, "Come and board the ship! Save yourself!" But they ignored him and climbed to the top of the mountain. Then a huge wave, bigger than the mountain they stood on, came and hit them, killing both of them. These enormous waves killed all other disbelievers as well. The water kept rising and rising, and after some time, the earth was completely filled with water. Then Nuh alayhi salam said, Bismillah. When the Prophet uttered these words, the ship started moving. The rains had stopped by now, but the entire earth was filled with water. The Prophet knew that he had to keep sailing for a long time. The ship had 80 people in it, and the Prophet had taken precautions to store enough food for the men and the animals. Allah had it all planned, my son. He made the ship suitable for the silent sheep as well as the violent lion. All the violent animals were down with some or the other sickness. All of them were living together. But the Prophet faced a lot of trouble because of the rats. They were everywhere, running up and down, nibbling there, nibbling here. They were really the troublemakers. And then Prophet prayed to the God, and it was then Allah created the cats. The cats hunted down the rats, and after some time, the rats started behaving as well. They had sailed for about 150 days by now, and they couldn't find land anywhere they could see. The Prophet and the men waited and waited for many days. The Prophet then decided to send a crow to see if it could find land anywhere, but the crow didn't return at all. Then the Prophet sent a dove in search of land. The dove flew away, and after a few days, returned with a branch of olive tree in its beaks. The Prophet and his family were really happy, as they knew that they were close to the land. The ship sailed further for some time, and finally reached on the top of the Judi mountain. The Prophet said, Bismillah, and the ship stopped moving. After traveling for more than 150 days, their journey had finally come to an end. The Prophet released all the animals, birds and insects first into the land. They went out and populated the earth back again. The Prophet and other Muslims came out of the ship, and the first thing he did was to put his forehead to the ground in prostration.